He is a fifth-generation British Columbian whose ancestors were among the first arrivals here in 1858 in what was then known as the New El Dorado of the North. He says his latest book is not unlike a cabinet of curiosities in the way it explores the hidden world of pre-Confederation BC. Here to talk about Untold Tales of British Columbia is historian and author Daniel Marshall. Welcome.
Thank you so much, John. I'm delighted to be here.
Easy question to start us off, Daniel. What made you write this book?
Well, really, it goes right back to my childhood in some ways. Growing up in a family with these roots that I have back to the Fraser River Gold Rush. When I was a young kid, traveling up the Fraser and Thompson rivers with my father, who was on engineering projects in my youth up in places like Cache Creek, Ashcroft, and so forth. I think it was those early stories, family stories being shared. Uh, I just loved the history that I encountered when I was a young child, that sublime landscape up the Fraser and Thompson River. It was just so utterly different from my childhood home here on Vancouver Island. And so these sorts of stories, I think, that were shared of my own family ancestors, one in particular, my great, great, great Uncle William, have been the foreman of the Dewdney Trail. If people know their British Columbia history, he conducted the trail from the Shuswap country over to the Big Bend Gold Rush, over the Monashee Mountains in the 1860s. He built some of the first roads here on the island. And so, I suppose, like many of my age group at the time, I was just fascinated by the more romance, I guess I would say, John, of the gold rush. These paddle wheelers and gambling dens and all that sort of stuff. We grew up, sort of the Hollywood version, I suppose. So by the time I got to the University of Victoria to start my studies in history, the gold rush always fascinated me. And it wasn't until I arrived at UBC to do my doctorate that I thought, darn it all, this province needs a fuller treatment of the Fraser River Gold Rush. And of course, this is what led to my book, Claiming the Land. In the case of my new book, Untold Tales of Old British Columbia, it is not unlike a cabinet of curiosities, I suppose, in that it's a collection of about 40 stories, including stories of some of our basic foundational history, how this place called British Columbia came to be. But in addition, it's quite an eclectic mix, really, of stories. And I'm hoping that people will enjoy this book. They'll be able to read everything from lost Gary Oak preserves up in the Fraser Canyon that are seemingly out of place to artifacts falling from the sky mysteriously, and quite a bit of the stories also look at these stories from the 19th century in particular. I do look at the maritime fur trade starting back in the 18th century, the land-based fur trade stories associated with that. But I think what makes Untold Tales decidedly different is I seek to place British Columbia in this north-south perspective of the Pacific slope, right? This Pacific slope. So we're talking Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, so on and so forth. And this world that existed prior to the reach of the transcontinental railways. We have these two transcontinental nations, if you will, today that were racing to get access to the Pacific Ocean, whether in the United States or indeed Canada. And the national policy of Sir John Macdonald, of course, sought to reorient these natural north-south flows, if you will, and realign them into the so-called national dream. And yet, British Columbia Indeed, places like Victoria, where I am right now, retained a maritime outlook to the south well into the 20th century. So this is what I look at. These really, these are transboundary histories. Looking beyond this rather abstract 49th parallel that was drawn across the map, that did nothing to, well, define, for instance, the indigenous populations here, or indeed these gold rush communities that were routinely traveling up and down the coast. So the book in many ways draws attention to the fact that that early American presence here needs to be explored further. Well, the Fraser River Gold Rush itself, I'll ask your viewers to remember that this was the third great mass migration of gold seekers in search of a new El Dorado, following the California rush of 1849 or the Australian rush of 1852. Then, all within the space of less than a decade, the Fraser River rush. This was 40 years before the more celebrated Yukon Klondike gold rush. And so this is just a very important, to my mind, a very important part of our history. To understand British Columbia, you really need to put it into this north-south context, this land west of the Rocky Mountains, in order to better understand some of the issues we grapple with today. Yeah.
Now, we tend to take for granted the British part of British Columbia, as you point out, but this part of the world was highly contested among a number of countries, and as you say in the book, BC could have just as easily ended up a part of Mexico, the U.S., or possibly even Russia.
Well, that's quite true, and that's a long history itself. These various sovereignties competing for this portion of the coast. There was an instance called the Nootka Crisis of 1789 that played out in the coast. I don't know how many of your viewers will be familiar with it, but this was the clash between the Spanish and the British that occurred on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Nootka Island specifically. You'll recall that Captain Cook had come in 1778, and the subsequent exchange in sea otter pelts led to this maritime fur trade period. But when the Spanish first started coming up the coast, about 1774, why were they doing so? Because they had heard that the Russians were coming down and were threatening to build a fort on Vancouver Island. When they came up, they didn't find any Russians. What they found, of course, were all of these British ships, American ships, rushing to Yuquat, or what Captain Cook had referred to as Friendly Cove, to engage in this very lucrative fur trade. And so ultimately, from the Spanish perspective, of course, the whole Pacific Ocean had been something akin to a Spanish lake, in the sense that for centuries, they, had domain over the whole of the Pacific, quite unfettered, no other contrary powers, until, these English freebooters, if you will, Sir Francis Drake, among others, coming up the coast early on, right, and questioning or challenging the supremacy of the Spanish in this part of the world. So this all came to a head in 1789 with the Nootka Crisis, whereby an English captain by the name of Colnet ultimately was incarcerated and shipped down to San Blas, Mexico, and was there for some time until he was allowed to travel by horseback all the way through the valley of Tepic to Mexico City to plead to the governor for his freedom. It's quite an epic story, and I think that's one of the things I like to talk about, is just getting beyond the confines of the present day boundaries of British Columbia, that there's all these quite incredible stories that connect BC to the larger world. So the Nooka crisis really is the event that allowed Britain to gain a foothold on the West Coast here. And as many of your viewers will know, ultimately, Spain retreated. The Nooka crisis was the high watermark of the Spanish Empire. And ultimately, of course, they ceded their own rights to the coast here to the Americans. And this is what led to this period of joint sovereignty that ran, where Britain and the US then held jointly the sovereignty of the coast from a European perspective that's emphasized. And that ran until 1846, when the 49th parallel was finally established. This is why in court cases in the province of British Columbia, dealing with Indigenous concerns, 1846 is the key date. If you're an Indigenous nation, courts have asked, okay, provide us evidence from, what was your traditional territory? Where did you fish? Where did you live? Where were your village sites? But also, where were you collecting your resources prior to 1846? Because this is the moment in which Britain had then claimed undivided sovereignty. Very hard for First Nations way up in the northern portions of BC, where the fur trade and certainly colonialism had not really made its reach, and consequently the historical paper trail is so much less than on the coast here, for First Nations trying to establish their larger claim of sovereignty. So yeah, it all starts there back in 1789. And whether it could have ended up Russian, it could have ended up American here quite easily, And so this is something, some of the stories, of course, that are in my new book, Untold Tales.
Jumping ahead a bit on the timeline, British Columbia joins Confederation as Canada's sixth province in 1871 because of the railway, but it very nearly left Confederation also because of the railway. What happened?
That's right, and I'm glad you asked that question. I look at the whole period of when British Columbia was considering joining Canada, and look at some detail also at the terms of union by which BC ultimately did join the Canadian Confederation. But what you're speaking of there is specifically with regard to one of the terms of union, and that was the bringing of the railway to the coast. Of course, from a Canadian perspective, if they were going to compete with the new transcontinental nation of the United States, Canada also desperately needed a Pacific coast access, right? To build the railway, to build this all red route, to be able to compete with the economic might of the United States that was emerging. So as you would well know, the terms of union essentially said that surveys would start within 2 years of having joined in 1871, and there would be a completion end date of 10 years. 10 years. Of course, Canada defaulted on that railway term, and this is what led to a number of great protests. In fact, people like Amor de Cosmos at one point, who had been elected to the Canadian Parliament, stood in Ottawa in the Parliament and basically moved for the peaceful separation of BC from Canada because of these ongoing railway defaults. And I go into that incredible detail. One of the great untold stories I tell is essentially a revisiting, if you will, of the competing line that was proposed, the competing railway line that would have come down to Butte Inlet as compared to where the railway runs today, down the Thompson and Fraser River corridors, down ultimately to Burrard Inlet. And truth be known, some people will never have heard this, that in fact, it was not the Fraser or Thompson River corridor where it runs today that was originally almost selected. It was, in fact, Butte Inlet. So I look at that, look at the fact that the Butte Inlet line was the first fully surveyed, fully staked out, located line in the province. It wasn't the Fraser River, which is fascinating. And so I explore the politics behind that. There was a group that formed in British Columbia at one point because of Canada's slow pace with regard to these railway surveys. And it was called the Carnarvon Club. In the period before there were any political parties in this province, the Carnarvon Club was probably the closest thing we had to it. Now, what was the Carnarvon Club? The Carnarvon Club was named for the then Secretary of State for the colonies, Lord Carnarvon. And long story short, Lord Carnarvon basically, as the highest authority within, the colonial period, was the person who would provide the dispute resolution mechanism, if you will, between Canada and British Columbia. And ultimately, it was Carnarvon who, in a way, chastised Canada, said, you should never have promised, for instance, the railway on Vancouver Island, today's moribund Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway, where the ultimate plan was to run it all the way to Campbell River, past Courtenay, bridge the straits over to Butte Inlet. It would have been a horrendous amount of money to have done so. But, the reason Butte Inlet was given such credence as a superior route was in part because of the loss of the San Juan Islands in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The Fraser River Gold Rush, of course, occurred in 1858. By 1859, you've got American troops landed on the San Juan Islands. And ultimately, the San Juan Islands would fall to the United States. For many here on this side of the line, what did that mean? It meant the Americans were about to put guns on the San Juan Islands in order to control the navigation through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So if that were true, why would you be running a railway to Burrard Inlet? The harbor wasn't as good as Esquimalt. You'd be farther away from the coveted markets of Asia. And also you would run the risk of going by United States territory, which at this time was still hostile, right? Manifest destiny, 54-40 fight. People don't realize, though, the great challenges that existed in this year of chaos, where from a British government perspective, they didn't know what the hell was going on out here. All they knew was one thing, that they did not want the California Gold Rush experience to be repeated north of the border on Fraser River. What was this experience? Well, let's cut to the quick here. Quite simply put, all of the conflict and violence that was occurring between these foreign mining populations and indigenous nations. I wonder how many of your readers would know that for someone like Governor James Douglas, who had spent such a great deal of his time down in old Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, he doesn't come up to Fort Victoria until 1849, when the colony is established at that time, the earlier colony of Vancouver Island. And for someone like Douglas, or so many of these mixed-race families who had been living south of the border, can you imagine when the 49th parallel is drawn, it partitions the old Oregon country. And so many of these mixed-race families have to come north to the new HBC, Hudson's Bay Company capital of Fort Victoria, which had been built, of course, knowing that they were losing their earlier base down on the Columbia. But there was an additional incentive for Douglas and others to come north. And what was that? By 1849, there had been many, many years of a continual migration of American citizens coming over the Oregon Trail, moving into the territory of Oregon. How did they deal with this? Well, there was something called the Oregon Provisional Government that was set up, kind of a compact between these early American settlers and the Hudson's Bay Company itself, a bit of a pseudo government at that time. But when American numbers continued to climb to the point where they became the majority in that region, they started to pass racist legislation. I'll just use one example, the classic example, really, and that was if you were a mixed race person, if you were a native, if you were part native, if you were Hawaiian, if you were a black person, or mixed race of any sort, you could not give testimony in a court of law, quite extraordinary. And by those provisions, someone like Governor Douglas, himself a mixed race person, a Scotch West Indian, could not have given testimony in a court of law. So this is one of the decided differences. In order to understand BC, is to put it in this larger north-south context, because quite clearly, when Douglas came north, when the HBC operations came north to Fort Victoria, one of the foundational policies of this place was the institution of equality under the law for all. And so what do you have immediately by the time of the Fraser River Gold Rush? You have the quite a large Black American population that's invited by Governor James Douglas to come north. They are promised equality under the law. They didn't have that in California. Again, not unlike Oregon, you could not give testimony against a white man. And so that was what cinched it in large measure for these early Black pioneers who came north. Of course, the best known of them being a gentleman by the name of Mifflin Gibb, who had been a merchant in San Francisco, who, they had a paper operating there specifically for the Black population. He'd been a associate of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Some of your listeners will know that name. Anyways, he comes north. And ultimately, here's probably the best evidence for the kind of inclusivity, comparatively speaking, for the time. Mifflin Gibbs is elected to Victoria City Council. In fact, he becomes acting mayor. He represented the James Bay ward, where I am right now. Where his house once stood is just a couple blocks away from me behind the legislature, where he raised a family, one of whom, his daughter, continued this family tradition on of the fight for rights for Black people. She went on to become the secretary treasurer of the I think I've got this right, the Pan-African Congress that met in Paris in the 1920s. A whole other great untold story. But it's just to say that Gibbs would never have gotten elected in California. Gibbs would never have gotten elected in Oregon, south of the border. So this is a striking difference. And in the same way, I also have another untold story, which looks at the founding of Canada's oldest Chinatown, which is here in Victoria. And again, Douglas inviting members of the Chinese population of California, who again were being persecuted, couldn't give testimony in a court of the law, were being driven from their claims, generally abused. And I came across this fascinating story of a Chinese gentleman who had been educated, learned the English language while in China, in Hong Kong, ultimately worked as an interpreter for the British consulate there, but also would eventually travel to California with his uncle, I believe, and quickly, because of his language facilities, became the chief spokesperson for all the Chinese immigrants in California, having direct representations with the various California governors. And in the little we know of this fellow, whose name in the 19th century press is referred to as Tonga Chick, which truthfully is sort of a Cantonese pronunciation of his true name. It's claimed that he left California in 1857 and returned to Hong Kong and ultimately Shanghai. But from my own research and fascinating documents found right in the BC archives, in fact, no, he in 1858, he's not in China, he's up here. He's up here in Victoria. He's in places like Port Townsend, in Bellingham Bay for the town of Whatcom there, with the interest of setting up northern operations, trade operations. And again, to emphasize, Douglas guarantees equality under the law. And so in this rather lengthier piece of the founding of Canada's oldest Chinatown, I look at this to some degree and the instrumental role that he played. You know, I've been doing a little research subsequently now too on this extraordinary individual. And after he assists in purchasing the first 20 town lots in Victoria for today's Chinatown, he does ultimately go back to Hong Kong and ultimately Shanghai. And long story short, he is considered today one of the leaders, if you will, of the Westernization movement in China at that time. So extraordinary that we don't know more about this. You know, here we are celebrating Canada's oldest Chinatown, and yet one of the founders, if you will, had taken steps to move Chinese interests north where they had equality under the law. It's fascinating. It's reported in the British Colonist of the day, of today's Times Colonist newspaper, where there's a reference from a Chinese delegation in the 1860s, essentially referring to how old Governor James Douglas had reversed the California policy. So these are the sorts of stories I'm trying to get out there on just how this place was created, British Columbia. And again, from the British perspective of the Colonial Office way back in London, they didn't know what the heck was going on here. All they knew is that in the California experience, there had been, atrocities, indeed instances of genocide against Indigenous peoples in California. And that was well known in Britain. And so really, the one and main reason, only reason it can be argued for the establishment of British Columbia was to create some sort of firm law and order to ensure that the California experience would not reoccur north of the border. And that gets back to my earlier work claiming the land, where, you know, someone like Governor Douglas, I mean, right from the start, he was always talking about the fact that it was Indigenous peoples who were the discoverers of gold, who had been actively mining the resource with their old trade partners, the Hudson's Bay Company, and warning Britain about what would occur, that violence would occur with this sort of cultural mindset being brought north, along with the pick and the pan and the shovel with these California miners, and arguing that a military force should be sent out to keep all foreign-born miners out. Of course, that was nixed. That wasn't allowed. They said, no, let the miners in. So that's just a fascinating story and says much about our so-called father of British Columbia, this mixed race governor married to a mixed race woman herself, you know, Lady Douglas, and the invitation to peoples of color and whatnot, and guaranteeing equality under law. You know, people on this side of the line were not having to pay a foreign miner's head tax, as was occurring in California. We had a crown licensing system, right? It was colorblind. And I think Douglas really can be viewed more correctly as someone who was, for the time, maybe not perfectly, but rushing to put in much more of a color blind policy, during his years. And it's in striking difference to what was occurring south of the border.
So many.
I could go on.
I know you could, but so many great stories, Daniel. Before I let you go, what do you hope people take away from the book?
What I hope people will take away from the book would be twofold. One, to learn more about just how this place was created, so we actually know. Because right now, there's so many practitioners of history who have no grounding in the subject, quite frankly. Two, that becomes more important because, in my view, as someone still an adjunct associate professor at the University of Victoria, but I haven't been teaching for a little while now. I went on to become chief curator of the Gold Rush exhibit at the Royal BC Museum some years ago. But my hope is not only for our population to learn this history, because I think it's essential to know, no, we don't exactly fit the Canadian narrative, or we don't exactly fit the American narrative. We have our own special and unique narrative, which needs to be better known here, right? And it will help inform people as to why we are where we are today. In the case of land claims before the courts, the outstanding issues of things like Indigenous title, so on and so forth. That's important. And then additionally, some of the other stories, whether it's talking about apparitions out on the Strait of Juan de Fuca or Lost Gary oak groves up in the Fraser Canyon, these are stories that hopefully that will delight the reader, that we can perhaps have a bit of fun too. And I think that's important because right now, British Columbia history, I do not believe, is being taught like it once was within the university system. And as a consequence, it's not being taught effectively, we can say, at the school level. So Untold Tales hopes to entertain and to provide a greater foundational knowledge of just how this curious place called British Columbia came into existence.
The name of the book is Untold Tales of British Columbia. It's published by Ronsdale Press. My thanks to historian and author Daniel Marshall.
Well, thank you so much, for this. I deeply appreciate it. The book now is in its, I think we're moving into its 14th consecutive week on the BC bestseller list. So it continues to grow. But if we can shapeshift the province's public consciousness a little bit through this, I'll be more than pleased. Thank you again, John.